Can we start? Can we start? Okay. Welcome, everyone. We have Mike Scholey here today. Mike Scholey has 45 years of experience as a practitioner, trainer, and consultant in ELT, and has worked in 20 countries. He has also worked in the state of Maharashtra on British Council projects, such as Maharashtra ELIPS, if some of you are aware of it, and is currently working on English for All Mumbai as a consultant also. Thank you, Mike, and we can start.
Thank you, Radhika. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to ask you two questions. First of all, can you put your hand up if you were educated in an English medium school? John? Yes. Yeah. And second question is, when we introduce English into the primary school curriculum, do you think it's better to introduce it in grade 1 or in grade 3? Hands up those who think it should be introduced in grade 1, English. And those who think it should be delayed until grade 3. Okay, about half-half. Well, this question of the mother tongue versus English is a crucial one, isn't it? It generates a lot of debate in India, and we have this dichotomy, or it could be a dilemma about what to do. It could be a series of difficulties in devising policy towards vis-a-vis the introduction of English in the primary school curriculum. But as you know, as you're all well aware, language in India is comprises a complex web of multilingualism and MLE policies throughout the country. And we've been listening to this throughout the conference. And there are many views. You have your individual views about how to approach and create functional systems within the primary school system throughout India. That's nothing new. And no problem has a perfect solution. There's no such thing, in my view, as best practice. There's only good and bad practice and approximations towards good and bad. And because otherwise, if we had such a thing as best practice, we'd have already perfect systems, and we don't have that patently. We don't have that. As the governor remarked the other day in the opening session, he said that all children in India deserve and need a quality education and similar opportunities. And within regard to ELT, this is patently not the case at the moment. That's why I asked you about English medium and those who have studied in English medium schools. Now, Janine Treffers-Dalla and Yanti Simpli from Reading University, I don't know whether any of you went to their session the other day. They're investigating at the moment multi-literacy development in children in the Delhi area and in other states, I think. And they're looking at the question of English as a subject in year 1 and as a subject in year 3, and also at English medium. They're going to observe the cognitive and linguistic development of kids in primary schools in year 3 to see what happens to their linguistic and cognitive development in these different situations. So I'm going to start with, I'm not going to make any judgments on EMI per se. I'm just going to give you food for thought. So at the end of the session, you're able to reflect and consider policy in your own areas of India and the primary schools therein. In 2014, last year, around Easter time, the British Council produced an interim report on English medium around the world, a global report. It was an interim report. I haven't seen the final report. I don't know whether it's published yet. And I've just copied chart 4 here, which is public opinion regarding English medium. This presumably is in countries around the world where English medium schools exist, obviously not in mother tongue English countries like the UK. And surprisingly, over 50% of the population within the survey found it a controversial subject, and a large proportion, 10.9%, were definitely against it, leaving fewer than half of the population in the survey in favour of English medium. Now, for me, EMI is a nebulous, very vague, inaccurate label for many things. It could be a single subject in a school, as it is in many primary schools throughout India. It could be a whole curriculum taught in English. And it could be by choice or imposition of the parent or the local authority, the metropolitan authority or the state authority. And it could be political or social necessity imposed by the government. For example, in the USA with immigrant populations. And I'd like to ask several questions, pose several questions to you to think about, to reflect on. Is it elitist, or was it elitist, or is it elitist in some places and not in others, in India at the moment? What does instruction actually mean? Isn't that quite vague? And within the term instruction, what kind of methodology is implied? Communicative, traditional, grammar translation? How are the teachers who work within the system trained? And is there any truly quality cross-curricular learning going on in these schools that use English medium? And how do we accommodate, this was my question at the beginning, when do we introduce English as a subject or as a medium in the primary school, grade 1 or grade 3, standard 1 or standard 3? How do we accommodate the mother tongue? Does it interfere with the mother tongue? Does it compete with the mother tongue? Is it more pressure on the kids, the young kids, often from very difficult environments in the first place? Is it more pressure on them in their early years schooling? And there's my question about standard 1 and standard 3. And then finally, what about, and this may be something you haven't thought about, or maybe have, about any psychological, long-term psychological or educational damage that might have been done to these kids who are forced to study a foreign language at the age of 6 or 7. The other day on Facebook, I saw this message from an ex-English medium student in Nepal. He went to primary school from the age of 9 to 16, to boarding school from the age of 9 to 16, so that's primary, secondary, and did his school leaving certificate at 16. And he was a scholar, so he was one of the 33% of students who were selected in this boarding school on scholarships. They were from low socio-economic backgrounds, and the other 66% of the students were from privileged backgrounds. They were fee payers, so they came from the professional classes in the Kathmandu Valley in Nepal. Now, he was a very successful student, very successful. He graduated, he immigrated to the United States and is now a professional person. So I was very shocked and saddened to see what he had to say about his English medium schooling. This is a realization 30 years almost since he left school. Would you just like to read that? I'm not going to read it aloud. That was a bit of a shock to me. You have this assumption that someone is given this opportunity from a low socio-economic background to go to a boarding school, English medium, for 7 or 8 years, succeeds, becomes a professional person, and that's the end of the story. And yet, look what happened. And this is going on all over the world, no doubt. This feeling that you've lost your language, your culture, and there's no going back. Sorry? Identity, your self-identity, of course. As well as that, there's this idea that all kids are the same. It permeates education systems throughout the world. It permeated mine. We were all treated as the same. If we wanted to ask a question, sometimes we were told to be quiet, the teacher was talking, and so our cognitive development was suppressed, repressed, and our potential wasn't allowed to develop. And it applies not only in a foreign language environment. There was a well-known comedian in Britain, a well-known comedian and actor, and his name's Alan Davis. And he was on TV a few weeks ago. I watched this on BBC World. And he was involved in an experiment with a professor from Oxford University, a professor of mathematics. And he was trying to discover why mathematics is such a problem with school-aged children. Did you love maths at school? I certainly didn't. And what the professor was trying to prove was that we all have a mathematics brain, like we all have a language brain, a part of the brain which has a potential to develop in certain areas of the curriculum. But because we compartmentalize our schools, we assume we have a compartmentalized brain. This is where these 7 intelligences came from, isn't it? And it used to annoy me a lot when teachers used to segregate their class and say, what kind of a learner are you? Are you a verbal learner? Are you a visual learner? As if it was just one compartment they had and it wasn't a mixture of everything. So they chose him because he was a well-known TV personality. He'd always said he hated maths at school on TV. And this is what he said, you know. He listened to the maths teacher. He didn't learn any maths. And this professor from Oxford proved to him through a series of experiments that he had a maths brain, and he had the potential to develop in maths even at the age of 45. And they proved this in the experiment. So it was an eye-opener for me, and it got me thinking about language as well, that we label a lot of the kids as failures because we treat them all the same. And these 2 lists I've published here are lists that I saw on Facebook, which were put on Facebook by former colleagues of mine in Turkey and Russia. And they're decontextualized lists, as you can see, with make and do and times, about time, after a while, as if we can learn and develop our language through decontextualized lists. And here's the cartoon of a teacher coming and a kid comes to school with a smiling face, and then suddenly the smiling face is knocked off him with standardization. I've heard it said in India a lot that, well, we learned English very well, so with Englishmedium, why can't the kids learn English very well? Well, I investigated UK universities because UK university entrance because I had to do French at school, and Rod had to do German and Russian, I think, or volunteered to do. And we were, at that time in the 1960s, we were the top 5% of the population because it was a selective system. So it wasn't surprising that 95% of the kids in secondary school passed in the foreign language. But when you develop your university system, as you can see here at the bottom left-hand corner, by 2011, university entrance had expanded by 585%, which means that instead of 5% of the school-leaving population going to university, you had 30%. Now, those 30% are not necessarily going to fall within the top 2.8% on the normal curve of distribution. So you're actually moving away to a larger proportion. You know the normal curve of distribution, yeah. You're dealing with more average learners in universities as well. And nowadays, far fewer students are opting to do a foreign language at school and at university, and the failure rate is much higher as a result. You've got a similar thing when you talk about learning English in India. When you say that, well, we learned English in our privileged schools, if we went to a privileged school, Englishmedium, therefore everyone can develop using this system. But you developed despite the Englishmedium, perhaps. It doesn't necessarily follow that your fluency was a direct result of the Englishmedium. Or it may be because you were in the top 5 or 10% of the scale in terms of ability. So what kind of quality control could we have in terms of the average primary school student in grades 1 and 2? Everything around them seems to be linear or rectangular, flat, compartmentalized. But I'd like to introduce you to the wet weather conditions, and that is a change in paradigm to CLIL, Content and Language Integrated Learning. And before we move on, I should emphasize, as several speakers this week have done, including Rod here, that English, any foreign language, is a communication skill if it's learned as a foreign or second language. So we're learning to communicate in the language for various purposes. Whereas traditionally, like French when I was at school, and German when Rod was at school at the same time, was treated as an isolated subject. And so we learn about, as again several speakers have said this week, reminded us, we learn about grammar, about vocabulary, about pronunciation. We learn to pronounce, of course, and literature is added on as an extra subject. Whereas, in fact, it's not necessary for this communication skill. And as far as the teachers are concerned, there are the guardians of tradition, and there are the explorers, those who are keen to experiment. So the guardians of tradition, we've been talking about trainer development and teacher development all weekend. Transmission of knowledge, English as an academic discipline, the explorers taking a more holistic, flexible approach with topical diversity within English in the school, and more process-oriented, learner-centered methods. It's important to realize, I think, that with CLIL, content and language integrated learning, the language is not stated. It's not, English doesn't appear there, so there's nothing to stop you having a judicious mixture of English and mother tongue like Marathi and Maharashtra within the same lesson. The two languages, and I'm talking about primary level, grades 1 to 4. I'm not talking about secondary schools here, just purely at primary level, especially lower primary level. The languages, the two languages, the mother tongue and the foreign language, or the second language, or whatever it is in India, in the area you are, can be mixed, can be combined with cross-curricular learning. Because remember that in the primary school, you don't have separate subjects. The teacher is a teacher of everything, unlike in the secondary schools where it is subject-wise, it's compartmentalized, much more compartmentalized. The problem is the teacher. Very often the teacher cannot cope with the language rather than the subject. So you can't use this argument that I don't have much English, therefore my kids can't learn any, although officially it's an English lesson. And so I'll use the excuse, we'll do a bit of grammar instead, because grammar's very easy, isn't it? The easiest thing in the world. For a teacher who's not very good, not very fluent or proficient in English, it's easy to teach grammar. You've got the books, and the kids just get on with the exercises. And that's what often happens. So CLIL focuses on content and language, the mother tongue and the L2, and the content is the real world. It's the cross-curricular area of the primary school education. So it's maths, it's science, environmental studies. There are two other foci as well, and one is the learners and the learning, crucially, Are you all familiar with the terminology social constructivism and cognitive constructivism? Yes? So, social constructivism, kids learning together, not the teacher dominating the class with TTT, but the kids working together with PAT. Do you know what PAT is? Pupil activity time. And cognitive constructivism, that part of it comes with developing problem solving, asking questions about tasks and activities within that primary level of, Piaget and development, if you like. And the third focus is psychological, educational practice, contemporary psychological factors like fairness, the governor referred to and other speakers have referred to this week, security, motivation, making the lessons motivating for the kids so that they actually enjoy, be it grade 1 or grade 3, they enjoy what little they do in English, not necessarily in English lesson, but in English activities, let's say English activities, within a mother tongue framework, which has implications for teacher training and classroom management and organisation and formative assessment. Excuse me. Now, I still see these simplistic diagrams. This was published by a Japanese in 2012. It's from an article about introducing CLIL into Japanese universities a couple of years ago. And you can see here that it's just a linear diagram with CLIL here, where I've put the yellow cross, CLIL CBI, content-based instruction. In an EFL setting, communicative instruction. But for me, the natural acquisition comes with CLIL. If kids are motivated in a social environment with stimulating activities, they will acquire some foreign language. If they're submersed in something interesting. So I've moved, my feeling is that we should move up, although I don't like the diagram at all, we should move it up towards submersion, sink or swim, but not sink, swim and survive, with some natural acquisition there. I'd like to come back to a little bit of theory here, and that's Bloom's taxonomy, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. I first saw this in 1956 when I was a kid, and not much has changed. It's this pyramid here. The verb, it's now verb forms because it's not what you know, it's what you do. And in the primary school, what we do mainly are what, would you say, if you looked at this pyramid, what do kids do mainly in the primary school? What do they focus on at the moment in primary school before they go to secondary school? Which one or two would you say? Yes, understanding and remembering. Rote memory very often. And if we look at this diagram, if we think about the cognitive processes of kids in primary school, where I've put the 4 smiling faces, you'll see that in terms of those 6 dimensions, remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating, they only have the remembering and the understanding. And in terms of the other dimensions, facts, concepts, procedures, that is knowing how to do things with language, rather than knowing about language, and metacognitive, that is understanding how you learn, what this self-awareness of learning and motivation, so that a kid can say, yes, I like this, I'm happy about this, I know that doing this I can learn better, which they've demonstrated in Maharashtra via drawings that they've made during the project. Then there's a lot lacking there. Despite the fact we pour huge resources into primary schooling of English, there's a lot lacking and a lot is not achieved. So, back to Bloom, we call those 2 lower level ones lower order thinking skills, and the upper ones are higher order thinking skills. And in order to promote higher order thinking skills in the primary school, the kids need to do some stimulating activities and problem solving and be able to ask questions. It could be in the mother tongue. This is very important. It could be in the mother tongue. It doesn't have to be in English. This is a misapprehension that how can they do that if they don't have the wherewithal in the foreign language. So it's scaffolding. It's building up their interest. It's building up and supporting their motivation so that bit by bit, gradually, they develop an awareness, an interest, proficiency in English very slowly, supported by the teachers, well-trained teachers, supported by the mother tongue. And then by the time they leave the primary school, they're much better equipped to survive at a higher level and develop better literacy skills than they otherwise would have been. That's another question. Reading and writing is another question which I'm going to ask you about later. So let's have an example then. So they have to do maths in the primary school. And I've taken one, it's cross-cultural, so I've taken dollars, which could be from Singapore, it could be from the United States. So they've got to learn a bit about the rest of the world. So I've taken cricket because of the World Cup. So you can read that for yourself. There's the problem. Just work out the answer. Okay, all got the answer? Now, the anticipated answer is $1 for the bat and 10 cents for the ball. But the actual answer is $1.05 for the bat and 5 cents for the ball. Now, in a traditional classroom, the kids, and you may or may not agree, but in my experience, the kids will be competing to see who can get their hand up first. And so they guess, because they want to shine, and probably get the wrong answer, unless they're very bright and they get the answer very quickly, if they're mathematicians, budding mathematicians. But in a constructivist classroom, in English, doing it in English with mother tongue, they have to use a little bit of vocabulary and a little bit of mathematics, and then they give the answer in English, say, using numbers. They've learnt the numbers, they give the answer in English, but they can work out the problem in Marathi, if they're in Maharashtra, for example. They have to cooperate, so the students are sitting in groups, and they arrive at the answer. This is this equality and fairness. You know, you have your weaker students, your stronger students, more privileged students with less privilege. They calculate, they explain, they discover. One kid doesn't understand, so the other kid explains in Marathi why. And then they agree on the answer, and they give the answer. The group gives the answer in English. So all the students are involved in arriving at the answer. Let's take another example. Now, this is what I call two-dimensional learning. It's what you did at school, it's what I did at school. We had maps, and they were two-dimensional. They were flat maps, they're on the wall, or if we were lucky, we had them in the textbook. And we did comparatives with them. We learnt a bit of geography. You know, we had a quiz. What's the capital of Japan? What's the capital of Hong Kong? There isn't one. And what's the capital of Malaysia? Kuala Lumpur. And I've taken one from a British book, so it's London. And then we could measure, for example, just a simple example. They measure the distances on the map, and then what's the question? Which is furthest from London, yes. And so the kids individually calculate them, put their hands up. Tokyo, miss. And which is the closest to London? KL, miss, or Kuala Lumpur, miss. But that's not the answer. And if you check on the internet using in an ICT classroom that you have, either now or in 5 years' time, you'll find something very different. Actually, Kuala Lumpur is 964 kilometers further away than Tokyo. This Kuala Lumpur at the bottom is 964 kilometers further away from London than Tokyo. So there's something wrong, isn't there? There's something wrong. What's wrong in this two-dimensional classroom? Here are I got this from the internet. These flight distances from London, you can see there, authentic materials. Well, what's wrong is the real world is globular. It's not flat. We never learnt that in school. So if you actually measure with a globe and a piece of string, the piece of string, and then put it on a ruler, the piece of string to KL will be longer than the piece of string to Tokyo. So flat maps, like classrooms, give us a false impression of the world, which we've always known, but we've tolerated. Thus, we have this comparison between a traditional classroom and a constructivist one. I'm not going to read it aloud, but if you could just look at it yourselves and look at the major differences between the two kinds of classroom in which we can develop the kids' linguistic ability in English. There are many differences there. Curricula, materials, learning, knowledge, teacher roles, students' activity in the classroom, and assessment. So what about a new approach, new training, new materials? We've been talking about quality training all weekend. We've seen quality materials, but the new approach we're not quite sure about because it's mainly teacher development, teacher training, trainer training. What about the poor kids in the classrooms? That was mentioned only a couple of times during the whole weekend, the impact of the training on the kids in the classrooms. Now, earlier, we saw that kids are often treated as the same, that they're rubber stamped, given compared, marked, and go away with a miserable face at the end of lessons, at the end of the day. But they're all different. They all have different interests, different abilities. And in the NCF 2005, the example that was cited by a speaker this week, between a group of kids in a rural area where transport would be a bullock cart and maybe a bus, and the group of kids in Mumbai where transport would be a train, a plane, auto rickshaw, whatever. Even the groups of kids in the different classrooms in the same state are very different. So their interpretation of a concept is very different. They construct their own knowledge. Now, CLIL, Content and Language Integrated Learning, can be arranged in several different ways. This is where the wet weather comes in. You can have a shower of CLIL, where you just have a little bit for primary 1, and then you get on with the rest of the lesson in Marathi. Or you could have a storm, where you do a project, or you concentrate on the same thing like nutrition, for example, or health for the whole week. Or you could have a flood, where they do something for the whole term, regularly with the same teacher. Depending on the quality of the school, we're out of time. The quality of the school, we started late, but the quality of the school, the quality of the teachers, the quality of the students. And this has been experimented with all over the world. In Brazil, as an example, colleagues of Rod and I, we know these two ladies who own a primary school in Brazil, and they're doing fantastic work with 7 to 9-year-olds in CLIL. In Romania, where primary school kids have been doing English and physics at the age of 11, and the head teachers come in after a flood of English and physics work on the weather, topic of the weather, with kids saying, naturally, hydrometer, hygrometer, chemical barometer at the age of 11. Head teachers come in and says, I can't believe this. He was incredulous. I couldn't even do this when I was 16. All a result of CLIL showers and CLIL storms. Can I continue?
Yes, please.
Yes, okay. So I've nearly finished. Teacher training, well, we've got the short-term stopgap needs, trying to fill in the gaps and the problem areas with in-service training. But the real answer is long-term training. We have this new BEd, new 2-year MA. This is when you have the ideal opportunity to rethink how teachers are trained to do something like CLIL in primary 1 or primary 3, whatever, with a revised training curriculum, teacher-educator development, integrated CPD with pre-service and in-service CPD. Breaking down teacher resistance. This only happens with older teachers. With young teachers doing the BEd and MA, you don't have this resistance. They take to this new methodology approach like ducks to water. In Maharashtra, we have ELIPS and IFA. You might have heard about that, doing exactly these things, but making puppets in the classroom, etc. Newspaper articles on that from the ELIPS project. Breaking down the tedium in rural classrooms is the newspaper headline there. The new LE Kids materials that Deepali was giving a session on yesterday. People saying there's been a huge change in ICT in India in the last 5 years. And Maharashtra, the new My English Books 1, 2, etc., where it's textbook-led, it's pushing for what they call SemiEMI, and so teachers are being forced to use English in the classroom, and they can pick and choose. They can the instructions are in Marathi. They can do what they like. So the good teachers will use a lot of it, and the poorer teachers, weaker teachers will get support and use some of it. It doesn't matter. They could even use environmental studies, the language teachers, the primary teachers involved in all subjects, so environmental studies in English. And you only need one specialist in a school who can do in-service work and demonstrate that things work and give confidence to her colleagues and transfer work, have a bit of timetabling flexibility. In China now, they've started with the very, very good teachers. They're working in local, what do you call them here, the local groups, clusters. The best teachers, they go and work on a daily basis in the different schools to feed into all of the schools, not just one. There's a new CLIL CD European framework for teacher education. And I was going to go, you might, if there are any Malaysians here, there was a big CLIL experiment there a few years ago with doing maths and science in primary schools. It was a failure. It wasn't a failure, but the government stopped it. It aborted it. And there are many reasons for this, and not least national language interests and badly thought out long-term plan for it, and very poor language improvement program for teachers who couldn't cope with it. So it failed for many reasons, but it was very successful in the pre-service, with the pre-service teachers who I was involved with for several years, and Rod knows very well. They were very successful pre-service primary school teachers, understood CLIL, loved it, and are still practicing it in Malaysian schools today. So the conclusion is this, and I'd just like to ask you to think about, do we really need to worry about literacy in English in the first 2 years of primary school? Can't we just focus on listening and speaking skills, motivating the kids, getting them interested, and then let them deal with the mother tongue those first 2 years, and then, this is not a proposal, it's just something for you to reflect on, then focus on writing and reading from grade 3 onwards. So, thank you very much.
I'm sure we wanted to know more. It seems like nobody wants to go out of the room. We're sorry to interrupt you, Mike. We really wanted to know more, but I think I must thank you especially for raising very important questions around EMI, so relevant to the context of India today, and proposing CLIL as a possible option for us to explore. Thank you very much. Thank you to you for being here, and a special thanks to the audience live who've joined us. And as a token, there's a small something for you. Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you. Thank you.